Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming tonight to hear our speaker. My name is Jane Kirtley, and I'm the Silha Professor of Media Ethics and Law here at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. On behalf of the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law, I welcome you to tonight's Spring Forum. The Silha Center was established in 1984 with a generous endowment from the late Otto Silha and his wife Helen. The Silha Center is the vanguard of the School of Journalism's interest in the ethical responsibilities and legal rights of the press. Among our many other activities and programs, the Silha Center sponsors an annual lecture by a prominent attorney, journalist, or scholar every autumn, and publishes a quarterly bulletin on current media law and ethics issues. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about the Silha Center. As many of you know, the National Society of Professional Journalists marked its annual Ethics in Journalism Week, April 24th to 29th. The theme of this year's Ethics Week was one of the core principles contained in the SPJ Ethics Code: seek truth and report it. SPJ sponsors programs throughout the country to discuss and debate current issues in media ethics, and tonight's forum is one of those events. It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Hill, who's the National SPJ Ethics Co-Chair, a member of the Minnesota Pro Chapter of SPJ, and News Manager of Special Projects at KSTP. He will say a few words of welcome on behalf of our co-sponsor, SPJ.
Thanks, Jim. Every year, Sigma Delta Chi Foundation, which is the charitable branch of the Society of Professional Journalists, makes grants available to stage Ethics Week seminars such as this one, and I think this is the third time that we've applied for and gotten some of that money and added some money from the Minnesota chapter and teamed up with the Silha Center to bring you a program such as this one. It's just one of the many different areas that the Minnesota chapter works on in terms of journalism principles, ethics, diversity, freedom of information. We're currently working on trying to get passage of the federal shield law with so many different reporters facing jail time or fines or other sanctions from the court at this time. So I believe there's some brochures at the back that tell you a bit about our organization. I encourage you to look at it and consider joining us and helping us work towards elevating the standards of journalists here in Minnesota. And with that, I turn it back over to Jane.
Thank you, Gary. In 1993, after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, I visited Bucharest, Romania, to talk about free press principles in an emerging democracy. During one of my presentations, a member of the audience who identified himself as a trade unionist asked me what I'm sure he thought was a very simple question. How do we make the press tell the truth? I think it seemed very simple to him because, having lived for many years in a country where the press was forced to report government propaganda and lies, it probably seemed simple enough to demand that the newly free press tell the truth. And of course, telling the truth, or at least never knowingly publishing an untruth, is a basic tenet of American journalism ethics. But experience of the past few years suggests that, at least for some people who are working in the news media, telling the truth is at the very least negotiable. Names like Stephen Glass, Jack Kelly, James Fry comprise a litany of fabricators and plagiarists. Why do they do it? How do they get away with it? Has the credibility of the news media been irreparably harmed by it? And is there anything that we, as consumers of news, as readers and viewers, as well as practitioners of journalism, is there anything we can do about it? Or is this just a small part of a much bigger problem? What should the role of the press be in the post-9/11 world? Should journalists be reporting classified information? Should the government prosecute them or their sources? Have business pressures changed the way the news media cover the news? And does the public even care? To help us explore the answer to these and to other questions, I'm sure, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Seth Mnookin is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and a former senior writer at Newsweek, where he covers media, politics, and popular culture. His work has appeared in many publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Magazine, New York Times Book Review, Spin, Slate, and Salon. He graduated from Harvard College in 1994 and began his journalism career as a rock critic for the now-defunct webzine Addicted to Noise. He's also worked as a crime reporter for the Palm Beach Post, a City Hall reporter for Forward, political reporter for Brill's Content, and was a Shorenstein Fellow in 2004 at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's the author of the critically acclaimed Hard News, 21 Brutal Months at the New York Times and How They Changed the American Media, which is about the Jason Blair scandal. This book was named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post and cited as one of the 50 best books ever written about the media by the London Independent. It was after I read Seth's book that I knew I wanted him to come and share his observation and reflections with us. It's not only profound, it's a really fun read, and I recommend it to you. You'll have an opportunity to purchase it and to get Seth to sign it for you at the conclusion of this evening. The title of his speech tonight is "The Customer is Always Right?" The Assault on Media Impartiality from the Empowered American Consumer. Seth?
Let me just make sure I have this turned on. Okay, there. I am going to attempt to make a fairly broad, sprawling conversation fit into 20 or so minutes. So I then have time to hear from all of you and what you're interested in. So if there are things that I sort of allied over in this talk and you want more information about, either ask during the question period or ask me outside. I think right now we are at a unique moment in the history of American media, both because of the pressures that journalists are facing from the government and because of the pressures that the media, in a larger sense, is facing in the marketplace. And I think those two things are not unrelated. In fact, I think that part of the reason that the government feels emboldened right now to move aggressively against the press is precisely because of the market forces that are also eroding the traditional press's power. That's where I'm going to end up in this talk. And I'm going to start with some history and, not surprisingly for me, focus on the New York Times. The New York Times began publishing in the country in the mid-19th century. And at the time, the way we think of the American press today as striving for an ideal of objectivity, that ideal did not exist at the time. There was no notion or pretense that news gathering organizations, which at the time were essentially newspapers, were anything more than playthings or / organs for their owners. They printed stories that their owners wanted publicized. That didn't mean that there wasn't real news and real value and real information that was in them, but there was not this notion of newspapers existing for the sake of a public trust. Towards the end of the 19th century, that had, if anything, become more pronounced, and you had newspaper barons like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer essentially using their very lucrative and very prominent newspapers to advance their business goals. Hearst once famously said, "You give me the pictures and I'll give you the war," which is more or less what he did with the Spanish-American War when he pushed the country into war. And that was the landscape, the media landscape, in 1896 when Adolph Ochs bought what at the time was a not successful broadsheet in New York City called the New York Times. And what he did from very early in the Times' history is he identified a market niche that was being underrepresented. And that was consumers who were interested in news that was not filtered through the biases of whoever the owner of that particular newspaper would be. So the New York Times, early in Adolph Ochs's ownership, was probably among the most boring newspapers or news organs that you could ever imagine, because they essentially ran real estate notices, court notices, official proclamations, page after page after page. So at the time, all the news that's fit to print literally meant anything they could get to put in the paper. And it struggled along like that for several years. At the start of the 20th century, as Hearst's papers and Pulitzer's papers and some of the other older press barons sort of began to claw away at one another, the Times began focusing more of their resources and efforts and energy on actually doing reporting. And they did this reporting, and they brought to this reporting the same notion of communicating an unvarnished truth, unreconstructed reality to their audience. And that was really the beginning of the myth, we can argue later as to whether that's a myth, but that was the beginning of the notion of there being an objective ideal which news gathering organizations can strive for and present to their readers. And throughout the first half of the 20th century, as New York solidified its place as the capital of commerce and culture in the country, and as the New York Times solidified its place as the most important newspaper in that city, the Times's standards and ideals became more broadly accepted. So what the landscape that we now take for granted, where we hope or assume that our newspapers and now our television news programs and our radio programs are not going to filter us whatever information they think will support their views or their biases, but instead will give us what is actually really happening out there. That originated with the New York Times. Over the 20th century, another aspect of the New York Times that was not that unique 100 years ago became increasingly unique, and that is family ownership of a news gathering organization. Newspapers, and then for the first half of the 20th century, newspapers were still oftentimes owned by families who likely weren't answering to shareholders and who could make decisions on their own about what resources they wanted to devote to an editorial project, how much profit they were comfortable making, et cetera. As you moved deeper into the 20th century, the Times and the Sulzberger family that controls the Times became more and more of an anomaly. And we got to then get to the point where we are today where, and I'm speaking primarily about newspapers, there are really 3 or 4 national papers that remain owned by a family as opposed to by a multinational media conglomerate. You have the Graham family, which continues to own the Washington Post. You have the Sulzbergers, obviously, who own the New York Times. And you have the family that owns the Wall Street Journal, whose name I'm now completely blanking on. But you have those 3 families, essentially. The Los Angeles Times, which was a family newspaper for most of its history, is now owned by the Tribune Company. In city after city around the country, you have these once vibrant pillars of the community, which are either owned by Gannett or the Tribune Company or Dean Singleton's Media One, et cetera. The reason why this is important is because media companies, as opposed to media families, are answerable to their stockholders and their shareholders in a very serious and extreme way. And the normal, or normal is probably not the right word, but a not infrequent level of profit for a newspaper would be 12, 15, 18%. What we've seen in papers certainly in Tribune papers, certainly in Gannett papers, is that those companies are looking for 25% profit, 29% profit, 32% profit. And to raise the profits to that level, you need to take money away from somewhere else. And that money usually comes from the editorial product. The Sulzberger family was able to avoid this because although they are in some ways a public company and that you can buy stock if you want in the New York Times, your stock does not give you any voting power over their board of directors. They have two separate classes of stock. So the Sulzberger family owns all of the stock that enables people to make decisions. And if you trust them enough to buy the other class of stock, you can go ahead and do so. Again, now fast forwarding through another 30 or 40 years of newspaper history and New York Times history, obviously one of the crucial things about the Times is this notion of family ownership. And Arthur Sulzberger, who is now the publisher and CEO of the Times, when he took over in the early 90s, there was a lot of anxiety both within the paper and within the greater newspaper and journalistic community that he didn't necessarily have the gravitas or experience or acumen to lead this paper into the 21st century. And he set about to find a editor and a sort of partner, a leader, who could help bring the Times into the 21st century. And if you're interested in all the ins and outs and intricacies of that, you definitely should buy my book because it's all in there. But the short version of that is he ended up selecting a man named Howell Raines. And Howell Raines had achieved his greatest prominence and success leading the editorial page of the New York Times. And without getting into a whole explanation of the difference between editorial pages and news gathering pages, one of the things that Howell did when he was the editor of the editorial page was to explode the notion of what an editorial page, and especially the editorial page at the Times, should be, which is decorous and even-handed and always taking care to present both sides of the argument. And he blew that up in very short order and became a sort of bomb-throwing, rabble-rousing editorial page editor to very good effect. And so when he became the executive editor of the paper in 2001, he brought that same notion of how he was going to run the paper to the news gathering pages. That was a problem. The main reason why that was a problem is because the news gathering pages of the Times have been imbued with this sense of working for a greater good. The greater good not being to bring yourself personal acclaim or to get attention or even to sell more newspapers. The greater good being to put out the single best newspaper that the men and women working at the New York Times can produce every single day. To not favor one politician or one business person or one coalition because they happen to be in favor or because their readers and their followers are going to be more likely to buy papers, but to make out the day's news report every single day for no other reason other than the editors and reporters producing the paper think that this is the most important story in the world today. This is the second most important story. Here's a nice other fun story that we think you might want to read, but not because we owe someone a favor or because we're trying to sell copies to 18-year-olds who happen to like this or that band, but because this is something that we feel like is worth knowing about. Howell totally did away with that notion in very short order. And he did this by doing things like finding crusades that he was going to set the paper on. At one point, he very memorably decided that whether or not the Augusta National Golf Club, which is the golf club in Georgia that hosts the Nationals, whether or not they admit women was the single most important issue facing women in America today. And there were many people and many people in the women's movement who felt that whether women with hundreds of millions of dollars could play golf with men with hundreds of millions of dollars, whether that could happen or not was actually not the most pressing issue facing women. But Howell repeatedly put it on the front page over his editor's objections, over his reporter's objections. The Times ended up refusing to run 2 sports columns that disagreed with this stance that his news pages were taking. So there was this feeling that from inside that this ethos that the Times had cultivated over more than a century was under attack from within. This culminated in the Jason Blair scandal. And that, we don't need to get into that at all, except to say that it's my view that Jason Blair had nothing to do with Howell Raines' downfall, other than he was literally the ignition. He was the match that set off the explosion. And if it hadn't been him, it would have been Judy Miller. And if it hadn't been Judy Miller, it would have been the next person at the Times that Howell had given free rein to do whatever they wanted because he was going to make them a star. That's what happened with Jason, and that's ultimately what happened with Judy, although the aftershocks of her reporting weren't fully felt until after Howell was gone from the paper. The way that this ties in to this notion of the myth of, or the ideal of objectivity being under assault from the American consumer is because one of the things that made Howell Raines so attractive to Arthur Sulzberger was the fact that Howell told Arthur he had a way to stop the slide of newspapers and of the Times in the marketplace. The Times had been losing circulation in all of its major metropolitan areas for years, and is still losing circulation in all of the major metropolitan areas that it distributes. And what Howell told Arthur essentially was, that's because we're not giving the readers what they want. We are not being flashy. We're not being sexy. We don't have enough stories about Britney Spears on the cover. People at the Times couldn't decide what was more embarrassing, that Howell was running these stories about Britney or that he was running them 3 years after she was actually a news story and the rest of the country already was on to Jessica Simpson or whoever the rest of the country was on to. Arthur is, as he rightly should, very concerned with figuring out a way to maintain the Times' tradition of excellence and also continue to be a viable business, continue to be a viable ongoing concern. But part of what Howell tapped into is this growing sense of entitlement on the part of American consumers to get exactly the information that they want, not to get information that news organizations have uncovered, not to get information that might be frightening or scary or difficult or go contrary to their worldview, but essentially to have their worldview reinforced on a daily basis. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what was going on at the Times, or it certainly wasn't going on to that extent. But if we look at the largest success story of the last 20 years in the media, and we define media as institutions that are reporting on news and not celebrity weeklies, and because those certainly have been enormous success stories. The largest success story from an economic point of view has undoubtedly been Fox News, which started in the late 1990s at a time when people said there's no way this country can support another 24-hour news channel. CNN is holding on, and that's sort of all they were doing at the time. And you're crazy to try and do this. And what Fox News did was, right from the beginning, they set out to define an audience in the American marketplace that felt as if they were not being represented by mainstream media choices. And at the time, that was a more politically conservative audience. And by choosing a tagline, fair and balanced, what they did was actually not try to say at all that we're fair and balanced, but say what they're telling you is a load of crap. And they're feeding you this media elite, New York liberal worldview that's anti-Republican, that's anti-business, and we are going to come in and we're going to tell you what's really going on. So it wasn't a news outlet that defined itself as operating on the same axis but from a slightly different vantage point as most of the other media outlets. It was a media outlet that defined itself completely in opposition to most of the other mainstream news organizations. And it's the same thing you get in conservative talk radio. It's the same thing that Rush Limbaugh does. It's also, and I am not at all trying to take stands in a political debate, it's also the exact same thing you get on liberal talk radio. It's the exact same thing you get on Air America, where the implicit message in Air America is, you need to listen to us because no one else is telling you what's really going on with the Bush administration, and no one else is willing to stand up to the powers that be in Washington. And so you need to listen to us. The reason I'm using Fox News as my prime example is because liberals don't seem to be as effective at it. Air America, I believe, was just taken off the air in New York. And if a liberal-themed talk radio station can't succeed in New York City, you need to assume that they're going to have trouble elsewhere. So that's right now, since the late 90s, has become a bubbling up trend. And what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, as there's been this explosion of media scandals, is news gathering organizations of every stripe across the country desperately trying to figure out what they can do to hold on to their audience. Desperately trying to figure out what they can do. And one thing that they've struck upon is by being more accountable. And what accountability has meaned oftentimes is listening to increasingly shrill consumers say, I want to know why I'm not reading about X or Y. And the implicit statement or question there is, I want to know why I'm not reading about the world as I already see it. If I'm in favor of Palestinian statehood, I want to know why I'm not reading articles condemning Israel. If I'm pro-Israel, I want to know why I'm not reading articles why every article that talks about the Middle East doesn't refer to Palestinians as terrorists. And increasingly, what news organizations are doing is saying to consumers, yes, you're right. We will do whatever we need to do to hold on to you as a reader, because we are facing a future in which newspaper readership is plummeting, in which fewer people are reading books, in which fewer people are watching TV news programs, and we don't have a clue about what to do about it. So if that's what you want, that's what we will move towards giving you. I find that terrifying. People have oftentimes, when I've spoken about this, have said, well, isn't that not dissimilar from the situation we have in Western Europe? Where in Western Europe, there is no myth or ideal of objectivity. And if you have 5 newspapers in London, there are 4 or 5 daily newspapers. You have center-left, left, moderate, center-right, and right. And each newspaper comes at the news with a very upfront political and worldview. The difference, I think, is because we've been operating off of this objective ideal in American media, instead of being able to shift our focus slightly and say, you know what, that might not be what we're going to do now. Now we're going to wear our biases a little bit more on our sleeve. Instead, we're coming at it from in complete opposition and trying to blow it up. So instead of Fox News saying, you know, all these people are saying that they're objective. They might not be. And so why don't you listen to us? We're going to report on the news that's out there. And we're going to tell you we're coming from a slightly more conservative vantage point. Instead, you have them saying everyone else is lying to you. They're not telling you what's really going on. They're ignoring the strengths of the administration. And my fear is that one result of that is a public that increasingly feels like they just want to throw up their hands. And when everyone is shouting at each other and saying, I'm right and he's wrong, no, I'm right and he's wrong, no, this source is the only place where you can get the news, no, this source is, you're going to get people who feel like, you know what, I have 20 minutes of free time in a day. And in that 20 minutes, I have 400 TV stations, 2 satellite radios, each with 1,000 different options, and an internet that gives me instant access to every single newspaper in the world. I don't need this anymore. I'm just going to watch my TiVoed, my TiVoed episode of Desperate Housewives, that worries me. When I was at Harvard in 2004, I was astounded by how few students. And by how few students, I mean almost no students, got a daily newspaper. It was not something that was a part of their lives. As consumers, if we are interested in having strong, investigative, powerful journalism, that's something we need to support, both by continuing to subscribe to newspapers, and magazines, but also by not adding to the shrillness of the general conversation when there is something we're concerned about, and also by stepping back and taking a look and saying, does this article or does this broadcast or does this radio show offend me because I don't think they're telling the truth? Or does it offend me because they're telling me something that goes against what I might have thought before this? And that's, I think, an important distinction to make. I'll stop. I had wanted to wrap this up by talking a little bit about the threats that the media is under right now, from the government and from the court system in terms of leaks and in terms of the constitutionality of reporting on things that the government doesn't want reported on. I don't think that's unconnected to the more general problem that we're facing in the media, because I think that there's an awareness on the part of the public and the government that the press is vulnerable these days. And you have had other administrations who've hated the media just as much as the Bush administration. Certainly, if Richard Nixon was here today, he could give George Bush a run for his money in terms of hating the press. I don't know about anything else. But what you didn't have at any other time was a really direct series of challenges to the First Amendment, which you do have now. I mean, that's what you're seeing day after day after day. An effort to reinterpret laws so that they infringe on the First Amendment. And I will happily talk about any of that or anything else during my question period, but I think I've probably already gone on more than I should have. Do you want to come up?
Thank you, Seth. And now, to provide a reaction and perhaps a counterpoint to Seth's remarks, it's my pleasure to present Kate Perry. Kate's journalism career began at age 16 when she wrote for the weekly Hobart, Indiana Gazette. She attended Indiana University before she moved to Minneapolis. She worked for 12 years as a copy editor, restaurant critic, feature writer, and reporter at the Star Tribune, and then joined the St. Paul Pioneer Press in 1991, where she was city editor, politics editor, Sunday editor, training director, and writing coach. Since December 2004, however, Kate has been the reader's representative at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, where, in addition to fielding calls and emails from the public, she writes a regular Sunday column responding to their questions and concerns. And we're very glad she's here with us this evening to give us her perspective. Kate.
Thanks for having me here. I spend every working day with the empowered American media consumers, and it's often a real study of extremes. In this past year, the Star-Tribune was targeted by talk radio host Hugh Hewitt, who declared it was one of the most liberal newspapers in America and organized an effort he dubbed Swarm the Strib, in which his listeners were to email the newspaper and its advertisers in overwhelming numbers to complain about columnists they viewed as leaning too far to the left. Before the effort dwindled, I monitored blogs where followers of Hewitt bragged that if enough people emailed the Star-Tribune, it could bring business to a halt at the newspaper, and that then they could turn this technique on other businesses. Despite this kind of shock and awe approach to announcing this campaign, it never really materialized into much. I think reasonable people, even those who listen to this particular program that can be pretty extreme in its content, thought this went too far. It was sort of the mob mentality transferred to the internet, and they pulled back a little bit from this form of discourse. On the other hand, readers from all points along the political continuum have emailed me links to stories on websites, and particularly in the foreign press, that they think are important and that traditional American media and wire services have been slow to acknowledge. It's allowed us to request coverage from the wires that we might not have received if we and our readers had taken a more passive approach and waited to be fed the news by the wire services. This kind of consumer activism toward the media is something I find quite thoughtful and civil, and kind of a wake-up call about what it's going to take to compete in this worldwide market of information where consumers have access to so much information from other news media, other websites, other newspapers around the world. There are media consumers who have learned to sort of puff out their feathers and look bigger than they are. A relatively small group can spam a newspaper with email to key editors and get some attention temporarily. It works about once, and after that it's pretty easy to see what's happening to you and get your perspective is regained. I participate in a monthly conference call with the other ombudsmen around the country. There are about 40 of us. And I'm the only one here in Minnesota, although there's a part-time ombudsman at the Minnesota Daily here at the University of Minnesota. It must be a rare student ombudsman. Almost every month we go over campaigns that we're experiencing that are being launched against newspapers in a variety of markets. When I first came to this job in December 2004, it was clear that those who leaned to the right had harnessed the power of the internet to influence traditional media with much more savvy than the left. Now I think that's equalized. In the heat of the last election and its aftermath, the left seems to have caught up on the techniques of pressuring media, particularly newspapers, suggesting coverage is biased one way or another. I tend to get roughly equal numbers of emails and phone calls from both sides of our great national political divide. Some of the changes by the Star-Tribune in the past year that were intended to make sure a wide variety of views were in the newspaper included adding a Metro columnist who was quite conservative, included the editorial pages looking for letters and op-ed pieces to balance our traditionally liberal formal editorials. From the right, I hear some recognition of those changes, but a strong message that they don't think that's nearly far enough. From the left, I hear outrage that the newspaper has caved at all to pressure from the right. Those on the left are very quick to say we undercover their events and slant stories to the right. Those on the right say exactly the same thing. When both sides are aiming at the same story, saying it's slanted right and left, it can be a little bewildering. And well, and that's about when somebody spouts that old bromide, if everybody's mad at us, we must be doing it right. I don't know if that's true or not. But if you can cut through the fog of those efforts, which are not really new techniques, they've just found a very efficient new medium in which to do them. What I'm seeing are also more moderate news consumers weighing in. They aren't as good at making noise, and they aren't as good at getting attention, But they have found a way into newsrooms, and I'm trying to use my job to amplify their voices in our conversations in the newsroom. They just seem to find it a little bit easier to crack open the door of the newsroom with an email than they do with a phone call, or, God forbid, walking in the front door to see all our guards sitting there. So much of this is about degree and tone and pitch. There's nothing wrong with any reader, left, right, or in the middle, calling the newspaper or emailing me and saying they think we're missing something or they think we've done something wrong. Nothing wrong at all. It's a matter of tone and whether we're civil in the way we talk to each other. At so many newspapers, and especially certainly at my paper, the Star Tribune, a lot of time has been spent trying to glean insights into our readers through the massive Readership Institute studies, through focus groups, through the daily work of ombudsmen to harvest the views of readers and bring them into the newsroom conversations. It's information that can cut two ways. A newspaper can go overboard and look at those studies and decide they're narrowly going to provide only what the readers say they want. And that's when I start fearing I'll see Anna Nicole Smith show up on the front page more frequently. On the other hand, it's also provided some very thoughtful guidance on envisioning stories differently and envisioning telling them differently to hold, so that they hold special appeal to some groups that have been slipping away from traditional media. We always talk about the younger readers we're so concerned about who aren't subscribing to newspapers in the way previous generations have. We should also be worried about women readers who spend quite a lot of time reading, but they're reading material that's sort of escapist reading. It's not news reading. That effort to appeal to women and young readers has brought fresh interest in storytelling, narrative writing, and just kind of liveliness on page one on the very best days when the balance is struck in the right way, in my view. Other days it results in serious news being stuffed inside the A section, nation and world news displaced to the inside to make room for lighter people features on page one. I think we're still searching very hard at the Star Tribune for what the right balance is for our market, this very learned, earnest civil market, and we may be looking for that balance for a very long time. We argue about it every day. In my job as an ombudsman, part of what I do is take what I hear from the readers and I make it part of those discussions and part of that decision-making in our newsroom. It becomes part of the conversational mix along with our individual news judgment. And that's enriched further by the neighbor who talked to us over the fence over the weekend, or a spouse who said something at breakfast. There are all kinds of things that influence editors and reporters in terms of what they think will be interesting to write about and present to readers. We just have to remember, I think, that part of our role as journalists is to make sure that our readers also get the stories they may not yet know exist, that won't exist unless newspaper reporters with a hunch dig them out. And we have to be willing to determine the truth and print it, even if that means I spend the rest of my week with bloggers flying down on my head. If we can be skilled at listening to our readers, digging for the truth, and printing it fearlessly, we'll put out newspapers that are hard to resist, journalistically sound, something we can feel proud about at the end of the day. And I hope at some point find that magical balance of what readers want that's never been easy, and it's certainly never been more complicated than it is today.
Thank you, Kate. And now we'd like to invite you, our audience, to take up the cudgel and join the discussion. Please step up to the microphones. We have them right up here at the front, and state your question. In order to have time for as many questions as possible, I ask that you keep your question brief and to the point, and please indicate if you'd like Seth to answer it, Kate to answer it, or both.
Yeah, the newspaper coming out every day, you don't have time to really go through it. I mean, I subscribed for a while to the St. Paul Dispatch, and I'd find at the end of the day I'd have a pile of newspapers because I was just so tired I wouldn't look through it. And my feeling is that what is it that a newspaper is going to tell me that I can't find out on television at the end of the day? It isn't like it used to be where you had time even in a working day to even go through a newspaper. So either of you can respond to that.
Here, I think your mic should be. Well, you're welcome to come up here, but I think it should be working.
Well, it's on, so I don't think. It sounds like there were two separate issues. One is if you have time in your day to read a newspaper, and I have no idea about that. The other is what you can get from a newspaper that you don't get from TV news. I think there remains a huge difference between what you get from a newspaper that compared to TV news. Most television news broadcasts are a half an hour, and so if you get a half an hour of the national news broadcast and a half an hour of a local news broadcast, combined you have an hour's worth of stories. And television news can do a great job on stories, but because of the constrictions on time, there's a different sort of weaning process for those stories. And so you get a smaller range of stories. If there are, in your daily newspaper every day, I'm basically pulling this number out of the air, but I know in the Times, there's about 100,000 words. If you assume 1,000 words is big for an article, you have somewhere on the order of 100 articles. And you're not going to get 100 stories even in a full hour of television news. And it would probably take you less time to go through the newspaper and figure out what stories it is that you may or may not be interested in. So, I think if you do have time to watch television news, you probably have time to read a newspaper. And I think the advantage of a newspaper is that it can offer a broader range. It can offer more depth on more topics. Television has the ability to communicate to more people in a shorter amount of time. Far more people watch television news than get their news from a newspaper. And there's a lot of television news that's great, but you're going to be limited in the type of stories that you can get.
Seth, it was a terrific book. One of the only ones I can ever say that was really hard for me to put down.
Thank you so much. Hear that, everyone?
Runaway pride and blind ego seemed to leap off the pages as factors underlying the ethical breaches that took place at the Times. Maybe not just in Raines, maybe in Sulzberger and others. But
right. So
I wonder if you agree and if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that was a big, to encapsulate in 30 words, briefly what happened at the Times. Howell Raines was made the editor, the executive editor of the paper on September 5th, 2001. So less than a week before September 11th. He came over having been absent from the newsroom for over a decade because he had been the editorial page editor, and absent from the New York newsroom for much longer than that because he had been in Washington and London. So he came into that job as an outsider, essentially, in this culture, and was greeted with a lot of suspicion. The Times, in their September 11th coverage, really did a lot of phenomenal work, and for that were rewarded with more Pulitzer Prizes than had ever been given to, in fact, more than double the number of Pulitzer Prizes that had ever been given to a single newspaper in the history of the award. They won 7 Pulitzer Prizes for their 2001 coverage. They won that in April of 2002. And by that time, this clash between Howell, the new power, and the old entrenched powers that be at the Times had become very pronounced. And I don't at all want to say that Howell was all wrong there and that the old powers that be were all right. I think there was plenty of bad behavior to go around in that situation. But after the Pulitzers, Howell had a monopoly on the bad behavior. He decided that what those meant was that He was the greatest single newspaper editor that had ever existed in the history of mankind. And those 7 Pulitzers were not a reflection of the training and dedication and work of a staff. It was validation of everything he had been saying, and was also validation that everyone else could go screw themselves, basically. So that played an enormous role in everything that happened at the Times from that point on. It played a big role in Jason Blair. It played a huge role in Judy Miller and her faulty reporting on the WMD situation in Iraq. It's recounting that really would be sort of going step by step through my book, which I know everyone's going to buy and read, so there's no need to do that. I think that pride and arrogance and a sense of being greater than the trust or mission or office that you are a part of or working with were enormous factors in what happened at the New York Times in those couple of years. So, why don't you come down so people can.
I have another question about Howell Raines. I just saw a reference online in the last day or so to a quote from your book. It was contained in Eric Bollert's book, Lapdogs, How the Press Rolled Over for the Bush Administration. And I don't have the quote exactly, but it was something in reference to how Raines said he wasn't going to be out warmongered by the Washington Post in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq.
Right.
I was wondering if you could correct that or talk about it a little bit.
I don't remember Howell saying that exact quote, and Eric Bollert is someone who I'm not a huge fan of his approach, which I often read as deciding where he's going to stand on a story and then looking for facts and arguments to support his opinion. One thing that Howell definitely did do in around the war in Iraq and the build-up to the war in Iraq is he came into the executive editorship with a reputation for being very liberal because he had run a very left-leaning editorial page. And he was determined not to let people use his liberal reputation as a way to hammer him. And so he made a concerted effort, and he talked about this. I don't think that quote is exactly what he said, but how he wanted to sort of protect himself against accusations of being opposed to the Bush administration or aggressively seeking out stories that would go against what their arguments for going into war. And again, I think that very clearly shows the danger of making decisions for reasons other than their news value. He was essentially trying to use the world around him as a way to affect his reputation. And who cares about, there are very few of us that know the name Howell Raines or that care about his reputation or that care about whether he won the most Pulitzer Prizes in history or the second most or the least. It's just not an issue. Whether we're at war is an issue. Yeah.
My question comes a little more locally. I'll direct it to Kate. The question I have is sort of at the confluence of three things. One is the way I observe myself following news these days is I tend to pick up a story first from blogs. And bloggers are not people who go out and talk to people and interview and so on, but they very quickly direct my attention anyway to what really is going on in the real world. And then I follow it in depth. I was following the Duke lacrosse team on day 2, and it seems like a long time before maybe the Star Tribune is giving any coverage to that story. And I'm thinking, gee, this is kind of old news now, Star Tribune. So that's one thing that I've kind of observed. There's another thing. I keep hearing about the threat to the funding of news departments, news departments, by Craigslist. Meaning that it used to be that what drew in the readers would be the news stories, but then what drew in the money was the advertisers. And now it seems like, I understand, the advertisers are kind of not there so much because people are going direct with Craigslist instead of going to the classifieds. Does this mean that the newspapers are going to find new models in order to raise money to provide the news? And might it be, this is where my question really is, that it might be electronic and it might kind of speed up the news cycle for people who are interested in following along the pace of the blogosphere?
Well, most newspapers do have websites. We do at the Star Tribune, they do over at the Pioneer Press in St. Paul. We are on a 24/7 news cycle. We have a continuous news desk that's staffed every hour of the day. And so you see the news refreshed very quickly on that website, and it's local news that's being refreshed that I think you would have trouble finding online in very many places. So in that way, the local newspapers and websites still have that niche of local news. It would be very hard to prepare yourself to vote in a state election on down the political ladder, only looking online or only watching television. Newspapers still hold on to that kind of coverage. In terms of advertising, I'm no advertising expert, but I can tell you, they're still raking in enough advertising money at the newspaper I work at that we haven't had budget cuts this year in the newsroom. There's always management of the budget and what are you going to spend your money on. There's not infinite money for a newsroom, but certainly in this market, which is blessed with 2 competing daily newspapers, they've been protected from some of the budget cutting in other markets because the owners of those newspapers know that if they cut things too far, it opens an opportunity for the competitor to come into their side of the market. So that's been a nice protective force here in the Twin Cities that I hope continues for a long time. But I think maybe you're reading an exaggeration on Craigslist or maybe some wishful thinking about what's happening to the financing of newspapers and the financial health of newspapers. A lot of these internet sites and bloggers stand to gain financially if newspapers do fail. So if they conjure up a very bleak picture and get you feeling like it's hopeless at newspapers and you're only going to read the truth on those blogs or on those websites, it's a way of taking readers away. And one thing I think people forget is this is a very competitive media world, and there's a reason that the bloggers and talk radio attack the mainstream media. They want a piece of that advertising. They want a piece of that market share. They want a piece of the circulation or the hits that you get on your website. There's a financial reason for them to try to batter their competitor for your time.
I'm just going to disagree a tiny bit with some of that, which is I do think that the threat to newspapers from sites like Craigslist are real, not because Craigslist is doing reporting, but because, and this is more pronounced in cities in which there aren't 2 dailies, the advertising money that was previously going to classified advertising, whether it was online or in print of newspapers, that is a very serious hit that print newspapers are taking. Newspapers do not make their money from the 25 cents to $1 that you pay. That barely covers the cost of the trucks. Newspapers make 90% of their money from advertising. And there's a lot of anxiety about classified advertising, about real estate advertising, and about the migration of that, not just to Craigslist, but Google is now interested in starting a Craigslist type service that connects buyers to sellers. And if I knew what to do about that, I would not be here. I would be in my mansion counting my money and owning newspapers because I would have, gone and bought up some newspapers and dealt with that on my own. But I do think that is distinct from blogs, that the classified advertising migration is a concern.
I have a question for Seth. What newspaper do you subscribe to and why?
I subscribe to the Times because I live in New York, I guess, and I've been reading it since I was growing up and living in Boston at the time. And then I read, anywhere from 2 to 3 to 5 other newspapers every day, not by going through them and reading them, but if I'm interested in a sports story in Boston, I'll look at the sports sites of the Herald and the Globe, or if I'm interested in the Duke lacrosse story, I'll look at the website of a paper there. But the paper I subscribe to is the Times.
Seth, excuse me. I share a lot of your prejudices about. I just need to swallow that.
We have plenty.
Thanks. I share a lot of your prejudices about what newspapers are doing to chase after readers that they think they can't get, and to try to write defensively to take away the criticisms that they're going to get from critics of the left and right, who, by the way, can't be appeased anyway. You seem to view it as a trade, that kind of pandering as a trade against the norms of objectivity, traditional norms of objectivity, and yet you could hardly restrain yourself 2 or 3 times from referring to it as a myth. And I also think it's a myth. But it leaves me in the confusing place, and I'm hoping you can settle some of the confusion. If objectivity is a myth and you aren't making your story decisions or slanting your stories to try to satisfy the customers, what is the guidepost?
Well, I think that there's a difference between something, when I say myth, I guess what I'm talking about is whether or not the reality of that is attainable. We all bring our own biases and worldviews and notions to stories, whether we know them or not. We all as journalists. I believe in evolution. So if I'm writing a story about science, I'm going to bring that mind frame to that story. And I'm probably not even going to be aware of it. That's what I mean about the myth of objectivity. That doesn't mean that journalists don't and can't always strive to be as objective as possible. Just the same way that I will never be a perfect son. But that doesn't mean that I throw up my hands and don't buy my mom a present on Mother's Day and tell them I hate them and whatever. I still am going to try and be the best son I can and the best brother and sister and friend and everything, even if the platonic ideal of that is never attainable. So when I'm referring to the myth, what I'm talking about more is people who say, yes, there is such thing as objective reporting. And the reason that bothers me is because, of course, there's not. And all that does when you try to insist that there is set up a straw man for someone else to knock down. Because then you allow someone to say, you can never be fully objective because you don't even know what your biases are, so don't even try. That's why we're going to go with this other model. So I think that's what, that is what I'm talking about when I refer to that myth of objectivity, but that shouldn't be interpreted and doesn't mean at all that I don't think that's something that reporters, editors, broadcasters can and should aim for.
My question is for Kate. The Star Tribune has spent a lot of money and resources recently on their redesign.
That's right.
And one of your goals in doing that was to attract people like me, young people. And as a young person, I still don't feel like the newspaper speaks to me, nor do I think it should. Of course, I'm not exactly your target audience because I'm a journalism student, so I'd read the paper no matter what, basically.
Good.
But I'm wondering if it's working, and are people trying to reach people like me at the expense of your core audience, at the expense of those middle-aged people who have been reading the paper forever?
It's kind of interesting. I was out this morning talking to a civic group out in Burnsville that's largely senior citizens, And they were basically asking the same question. And one of them said, you had a story on your front page about how teenagers invite each other to the prom. And she was saying she was upset about this. It had displaced a news story, a serious news story that she wanted to read. And before I could even answer, another person in the audience said, wait a minute, I like that story. And they started arguing with each other about whether that story should have been on page 1. So it's hard to figure out how to please who in what demographic group. It's very hard for a bunch of editors who are baby boomers to sit in a news meeting and figure out what you want on the front page of the paper. I like to play a game with my daughters who are 20 and 17, and when I watch the editors tie themselves in knots trying to figure out what to put on page 1 to appeal to them, I just lay the paper out the next morning and say, what do you think is interesting on that front page? And they never pick the story that the editors thought they would be interested in, ever. I've never had them pick it. So it is difficult to do. At the same time, we're very troubled by the trends, and we'd like to find some way to design a front page that helps busy people read the paper and would offer an entrance point for somebody like you, or for a woman reader, or somebody else who might walk by that newspaper and not pick it up, and we hope that'll pull them in and they'll get into other kinds of stories and read them. I don't know what else you do. You can watch the demographics and see what's going to happen if we don't reverse this somehow. I hope that if you're not reading newspapers, you're going online and watching TV news and getting your news somewhere else. I just fear you're getting kind of a shallow veneer of news, and you're not getting the depth you could get just on the topics you love in a newspaper. And you don't have that delightful habit of picking up a newspaper and some coffee on Sunday morning, and I hope my kids have that habit when they grow up. It would be a big loss if they didn't. But yeah, we put a lot of money into that redesign. I've heard just fleeting new readership numbers that suggest there's been some success to it. I don't have the details yet, but we heard just sort of the headlines of it a couple days ago, and we're all kind of waiting to see the rest of it and dig down in it and see what's happened there. A number of readers who are loyal readers were very upset about that redesign, and mainly they're upset about the mix of news on the front page. On the other hand, they're really happy about the world section that runs on Monday and Thursday. There aren't many papers in the country that added space this year to put a section in the paper of world news, but we think that's really also a very effective way to serve our core readers, our traditional readers. We'd just like to make you a core reader, and we're working on it. We're not perfect yet. You should call me and tell me what you want to read in the paper. I'll tell them.
My question would be equally effectively answered by either of you, depending on who has the opinion, but I find myself sort of overwhelmed by the sheer amount of arenas in which I can get my news from, and I find myself sort of resolving myself to watching one thing at a certain time every day. And do either of you feel that that's detrimental to depend on one channel or one time of one medium to depend on their news from, or do you think that it's important to get your news from a broad spectrum and different types of mediums from different. What's that?
What is that thing?
I always watch the 10 o'clock news on Carlo, and I always just find myself resolving to doing that because I can't really fit in reading newspaper into my morning, and it just ends up being that's what it is because I want to get my news. So, judging that there are the biases that there are within the news today, and judging that some stations cover certain topics while others may skip them. Do you think that's detrimental to depend on one source?
Well, I get a little worried when the only source is television news because their time is so limited. We have very high quality commercial television here. We're really lucky about that. But it's headlines, and you don't get the depth I wish you had. You don't get some of the neighborhood news that you should probably have. You don't often read news about the University of Minnesota or hear news about the University of Minnesota on television unless there's been a catastrophe over here. Those are some of the nuances you miss with that. It's better than not doing anything at all. Basically when you're looking for media, you're looking for an editor you trust to sort through this ocean of information and pull together a report for you that'll satisfy your news needs. And if you find an editor you trust who you think has really good judgment and is showing you everything, and not just showing you what you want to see, but showing you maybe some ugly things you really don't want to look at, but you should. If you find that editor, wherever it is, that's probably serving you pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. I sort of feel, I don't want to be, I feel like someone saying you need to eat, 6 servings of vegetables a day, and no one's going to do that. And so your tendency is to just say, I'm not going to eat any vegetable. If I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do, then forget it. And if anyone is spending any dedicated time a day consuming news, that's great. I mean, that's great for me for a purely selfish standpoint, because that's how I make money. So I need people to consume news, or I need to find a new job. But it's also great because I want to live in a world in which people are informed. I think that if the world we live in gives you the option of being incredibly focused and selective. So if you have let's say your 10 o'clock news is where you want to get your general news, and then you hear about something from a friend that is happening at the university, you can then access the university newspaper or the Star Tribune or any number of other websites to get information about that. If you're really interested about something happening internationally, you can go to the website of a paper that deals more with that, or to an English language website of a foreign paper. That doesn't mean that if you click on nytimes.com, you're under some moral or ethical obligation to read that day's paper online. People should be really selective and very picky. It's I think, naive to think that we can train consumers to spend more time consuming news. What we can tell people is that to be a consumer of the Star Tribune or the Daily Minnesotan doesn't mean that you need to subscribe every day or read it every day. We're just as interested in those people who are coming here for 1 or 2 specific stories. Go.
It's a battle. This is a purely selfish question, but as a journalism student and for the rest of the journalism students in the room, do you think that you could address how we can do this, how we can not cater to just what people want or just surface e-news, but at the same time take our readers into consideration? Either of you.
Sure.
Because I have no idea. I was thinking as I was. Did I turn this off again? Am I now? No. Okay. As I was talking, I didn't want to make it sound as if I think there's a danger of people waking up tomorrow and picking up the Star Tribune or the New York Times, and all of a sudden finding a newspaper that's dedicated solely to what this and that audience segment thinks they want. I think what we're talking about is more akin to when we discuss the shrinking of glaciers on Antarctica, that every day there's a tiny, almost imperceptible change, and one day we're going to wake up and the entire landscape will be different because of this. That's a somewhat circuitous way of completely avoiding your question. I don't know I think it's tricky. I think one thing we can do is have conversations like this, not just in forums like this, but in newsrooms. When I was at Newsweek, this was a conversation that we had not infrequently. When we would talk about, Newsweek, if you look at the news weeklies, they look less and less like news weeklies and more like lifestyle magazines. And we would have that conversation a lot about, what are we doing here? Are we getting people the information that we feel like they need? Or have we become a, sort of fluffy package in which we hide a couple of tiny serious stories? Just by being curious, by having those conversations, by discussing them, where you work. I think that's something that can hopefully help, because if not, I don't know what to say. I mean, unfortunately, you and me and Kate, and at the end of the day, are not the people who make the decisions about the budgets or the news hole or any of that. The other thing we can all do, as consumers, is buy newspapers, tell places when we think that they're doing a good job. Be those readers who call or email Kate and say, I'm glad I read this story in the Star Tribune. So when she's then asked for a list of, what kind of feedback she's getting, she can say, and we have a lot of people who think we're doing a really good job. That's all things that we can do on a sort of very small scale level. I don't know if that'll lead to like a grassroots revolution in news consuming, but it's worth a shot.
It seems like a lot of people are going to online to get their news, whether it be traditional news sites or blogs or whatnot. I was just wondering if either of you feel that the traditional print newspaper will ever go away completely to be replaced by solely electronic newspapers.
Well, Arthur Sulzberger famously said that the newspaper will never go away because you can't bring your computer into the bathroom, which you actually can now. So it doesn't really. I mean, this has no reflection on your question at all, but I don't really care that much, and in that I only mean that. If the Star Tribune is published in 50 years in only electronic form, and you get it on an erasable tablet that you carry around and is updated instantaneously throughout the day, which already exists, that's great. I mean, that gives more immediate news to the consumer. It could potentially create a larger audience for news because it's more portable, it's more immediate, it's more direct. I have no special attachment to newsprint slathered on dead trees. And I think a lot of people do. I mean, a lot of people feel like it would be horrible if we didn't have a physical newspaper. I happen to like physical newspapers, but, and I don't like reading 4,000 word stories online. But there are a lot of people who do, or who don't mind that. So I would actually be shocked if newspapers were anything more than a sort of romantic relic of the past. Like there might be, I don't even think there are telegraph machines anymore anywhere. But or like telex machines, or like what film cameras will be in 30 years. They'll be something that high-end aficionados collect and use, but that has no real functional purpose for the rest of society. That's not bad, that's just the direction we're heading in my view.
I'd like to take it towards more with government's attempt to attack journalists, whether it be I read recently.
I'm sorry, to attack journalists,
or just to lessen their power, et cetera. In First Amendment, trying them by espionage acts or what have you. And I was at Floyd Abrams' talk last fall, and he didn't seem to be so sure about the possibility of such a shield law actually being enacted. And I was just wondering if you think that something like that is necessary, and what is the possibility of it even becoming to be?
I think right now there's almost no possibility of a shield law being enacted because there's no groundswell. The only part of the population that feels like that's needed is journalists, and there is no part of the population that is held in less high esteem than journalists, so that's not going to get us very far. Politicians today could get more votes arguing against a shield law than for one, which is sort of an ironic and somewhat frightening thought. Shield laws shouldn't be needed. I mean, the First Amendment could not be clearer. The no law abridging the freedom of the press, there's not a lot of wiggle room there. There are these two specific laws that were passed in this century that have never been applied on a widespread basis that now, for the first time, are being applied against journalists and against their sources. I don't know. I have no idea where that's gonna end up, and I have no sense. I have no crystal ball through which to peer and say, this is how it's going to affect us. I would say on the other side that Britain has what's called an Official Secrets Act, which essentially makes it illegal to leak or publish government secrets, any classified information. And the Downing Street memo appeared a couple of years ago. I guess we don't know what we're not getting until we find out that we weren't getting it, but there seems to be a fairly robust culture of reporting in Britain. So I tend to think that the extreme hand-wringing about what the enforcement of this 1917 and 1950 law would mean to be just that, a little bit extreme. I think the greater immediate threat is journalistic institutions not going after those stories and a public apathy in response to them. I mean, the two stories that won the Pulitzers that may be prosecutable, the story in the Washington Post about the secret CIA black prisons and the story in the New York Times about domestic eavesdropping, there's not been a huge outcry on the part of the American public about either of those. I mean, they both have gotten their fair of attention, but neither of these have been huge rallying cries for the public or even significant areas of concern. The fact that our government is running secret prisons and eavesdropping on American citizens, I mean, maybe I'm naive, but I thought those were both pretty serious stories. And, they're for by and large segments of the population are saying not only that they don't care, but that they don't want to hear it and they think it's wrong to report it. So,
Gary Hill, you're going to get the last question.
Seth, you made just kind of a little passing mention of accountability, and I think we've been talking in terms of whether or not providing the readers what they want. But to me, I was looking back at the Jason Blair thing. Not only was it Howell's arrogance, but that the whole paper was so tone deaf that he could be out there making things up, and nobody would even call and say you just got it wrong. Or the Virginia Attorney General held a news conference and said all of his reporting on the sniper killing is flat wrong, and nothing happened. So don't you think that a public editor was an appropriate response to those things in terms of being accountable and listening to what the public has to tell us?
Yeah, I'm not opposed to public editors by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, what I'm talking about in terms of the empowered consumer occurs more on the marketing side, more on the marketing side isn't even the right word, but I'm talking about more on the level of choosing an editor who's actively going to try to create a mix of stories that's going to appeal to this segment of the to younger people or older people or richer people or whiter people or more female people. I'm talking about that more than on a broad sense, more than these, email campaigns. And because I think now editors and especially public editors have gotten pretty sophisticated about where that's coming from. So, let's say the Star Tribune runs a story about President Bush, and so-and-so goes on air and says, we're going to mail bomb them with email complaints. They'll know within 5 minutes that those are all form letters that have been sent. What is what I'm talking about a little bit more is if over a period of a couple of years, the Star Tribune editors and the publisher and the advertising department at the Star Tribune sort of begins to feel that, you know what, there's not a lot in it for us to really go after the president because that's not what people want to hear. Maybe it's not even because they support the president. Maybe it's just because they would rather read about the fact that today the Supreme Court said Anna Nicole Smith could go after her husband's fortune. And so you start to see that migration, and it's a more general thing as opposed to a specific story thing. The Virginia prosecutor case, or attorney general case, in terms of the sniper and Howell Raines is a little bit deceptive because what happened was Jason Blair fabricated a story about the snipers. The Virginia Attorney General went on television and said, everything in this story is wrong, and hopefully that raised some red flags because Jason was a rookie reporter on that story who didn't have sources in that community. It actually did raise some flags, and they had other reporters go and editors talk to the AG, and he wouldn't say what was wrong with it. So they were sort of left not knowing where to turn. He only said it's wrong. He didn't say this is wrong and this is wrong, or I know categorically that this is not true because the opposite is true. So he wouldn't give them any details on the record or off the record about what to do about that. And you get that not, if every time a government official said, you got this wrong, if you throw up your hands and said, all right, we're wrong, you would be in trouble. I do think that more concerns should have been raised at that point about why a senior law enforcement official was talking so strenuously about what had seemed like a page one scoop by a reporter with zero experience covering the FBI, any of those police departments, or any federal law enforcement officials. But they did try to do something in that situation. So if people have other lingering questions, I'll be hanging around signing my book, which someone said they couldn't put down. So, and thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to the Silha Center for having me. It was really great.
Please do join us out in the lobby. As Seth says, you can buy his book. We also have light refreshments available for you, so please join us outside.